This is a collection of 3 stories found on the r/NoSleep subreddit. These stories were submitted by users of the subreddit, and I will be leaving links to their posts down in the description below. Now, let's begin. Every elementary school has a ridiculous urban legend. My school had Muppet Man, and I hated him. Muppet Man was deformed. Ill-fated plastic surgery left him with the ghastly proportions of a marionette puppet, so he stole a rainbow animal costume from the school theater and wore it everywhere. He lived in an ancient oak tree in the recess yard. Some kids claimed he lived in the branches, watching us play from camouflaged hideouts of leaves and twigs. The more morbid kids said that he lived in the trunk, eating caterpillar larvae and torturing the ghost of Jason Hughes. Jason Hughes wasn't an urban legend, unfortunately. He was just a tragedy. A doomed, anxious wreck cursed with ridiculously oversized glasses and an obsession with drawing. I remember feeling angry one rainy afternoon because I wanted to color with the teacher's new markers, but Jason already used all the paper in the classroom. Nobody really liked him much, including me. I don't know why. He was a sweet kid. Fretful, anxious, and a little too smart for his own good, but sweet. Jason disappeared on a November evening in 2nd grade. A few days later, a teacher found his clothes piled at the base of the schoolyard oak tree. The principal called a school assembly to make the announcement. He made it sound like the clothes had been laundered and neatly folded, but my dad, a cop at the time, a cop with a bad habit of telling his kids things nobody should have to know, told me Jason's clothes were filthy. Worse than filthy, in fact. Matted with urine and feces and blood. He told me I couldn't repeat it to anybody. I never did. It was too horrifying to even think about, let alone share. That's why I hated Muppet Man. Nobody could say his name without some snot-nosed little shit from behind the tracks saying Jason's. A horrifying schoolyard litany. That was another problem. Kids at school knew Jason was my neighbor, and they knew my dad was a cop. After weeks of hysterical interest, I was abruptly ostracized. It suited me fine. Over the past couple years, my dad had arrested the parents of at least 2 kids in my class, and they gave me hell for it. It was alright. I preferred books to people anyways, and I spent every recess reading under the oak tree. Sometimes I pretended to read to Jason's ghost. Penance, I guess, for treating him so poorly. One day in February, I got to school 2 or 3 hours late. I don't remember why, I only remember getting to school and plodding across the empty recess yard. February is a bad month in that particular corner of the world. The sky goes from polished steel in the morning to icy steel in the evening, and at night dims to a flat, weary darkness that makes my heart ache. The plants are all dead, the trees skeletal, except for flourishing colonies of mistletoe. It looks like despair. The empty recess yard was no exception. Everything was gray and pale and somehow brittle, like it would crack and shatter if you touched it. The almost preternatural stillness turned that pale winter fragility into something sinister. Paranoia swirled through me suddenly. What if, just what if, it was true? What if the universe was broken? What if the scene before me was a fragile husk, just waiting for a misplaced step to break into pieces? I swallowed a surge of panic and took extra care with each step, setting my foot down with excruciating gentleness. Sand crushed under my soles. Everything felt solid, but the sense of glassy fragility persisted. I fought the urge to close my eyes and walked as quickly as I dared. My path took me right past the oak tree. Black, blown glass bark glimmered faintly. Branches threw spiderweb patterns against the grim sky. They were bare except for nests of mistletoe. The tree was infested with it. Suddenly, with a disconcerting, painfully adult burst of clarity, it occurred to me. The tree was dying. I slowed to a halt, staring at it with the kind of hushed reverence you're supposed to feel in a church. The tree was scary but beautiful at the same time. More than that, It was a pillar of my memory. It was visible from my backyard, towering over my school and my childhood like a reassuring and eternal sentry. Except it wasn't eternal. It would be gone someday, maybe before I left grade school, maybe sooner. My throat felt hot and tight. I took in the sight of the bare branches and tried to mentally edit out the mistletoe clusters. It was difficult. They burst from the tree thicker than summertime leaves, and they kept moving, jostled, no doubt, by the cold winter wind. Except in another brutal, bleak epiphany, I realized there was no wind. The dark mistletoe rushed and writhed like a trapped serpent. Cold air stung my eyes as they widened. Bright bursts of color flickered inexplicably among the branches, slithering through the mistletoe like a multicolored feathered boa. And glittering in that sinuous rope of color, eyes. Glassy round eyes the color of limes. The rope of color broke into tendrils and grew, not unlike the fungus in which it nested, overtaking the darkness with eye-wateringly vibrant neon hues. Then they twined back together, worming behind branches and mistletoe before resolving into a fluffy, ridiculously proportioned character of an animal. A cartoon incarnate. A Muppet.
"Hello,"
it said. Its voice made me jump. Full and hearty and unpleasantly friendly. A cartoon voice. My lip trembled. Tears pricked my eyes, scorching and frigid at once. "You're not real."
"Yes, I am."
It fixed me with a sharp reptilian stare that made me want to scream.
"I might even be realer than you."
The world looked glassier than ever, faded and brittle, except for the obscenely bright monstrosity above me. I stamped my foot and held my breath, praying that the world would shatter, taking the Technicolor monster with it. If I broke a broken world, would I break anything at all? But the pavement remained solid. The frozen chill bypassed the soles of my shoes and leached into my feet. The creature stretched and stretched and stretched, slowly snaking its way down the trunk of the tree, simultaneously sloth-like and reptilian, bursting with that ridiculous Crayola fur. It should have been funny. Why wasn't it funny? Why was I scared? Why wasn't I running away? It slid down the bark until its eyes were level with my own.
"Only really real things can hide themselves in plain sight. Real things like me and Jason Hughes. Your friends call me Muppet Man. You can too."
It extended a hand, long and absurdly thin, almost like distorted frog feet, except for the rainbow fur. I turned and ran into the school, screaming all the way. The poor nurse tried to extract the story from me. I don't even remember what I said. I just remember hiding under her desk and sobbing. When I finally blubbered the words Muppet Man and Jason, the school went on lockdown. The cops came. My father wasn't with them. I watched through the window, gagging and crying and trying to forget Muppet Man's bright green eyes. But how could I when everything else, the oak tree and the police, the nurse and the sky and my own shaking hands, looked so brittle and faded? Muppet Man was the only vibrant thing. The only bright thing. The only whole thing. The only real thing. Sometime later, maybe a minute, maybe 10 hours for all I knew, a cop came into the nurse's office. He grabbed my elbow over the protestations of the nurse and marched me outside. The world rushed past me in a gray, dead, glittering blur. The tree loomed ahead, dark and blank and terribly close. I flailed, but he dragged me to the oak tree and shoved me forward. I stopped inches from the bark, dark and dead and cracked, except for absurd tufts of Technicolor fur. "Did you do that?" the cop demanded. "Do what?" I screamed. "Do what?" "Did you put that on this tree?" he said, pointing to a particularly obscene knot of neon pink fur. I told him no. I told him it was Muppet Man, that I had seen Muppet Man, that Muppet Man knew Jason, and now he knew me. The nurse sent me home shortly thereafter. and my parents packed me off to my grandparents' house in San Diego that very night. I stayed for 3 weeks. Stayed until I stopped having nightmares of Muppet Man eating Jason's bloody, shit-stained clothes while I watched, trapped by his bright eyes like a deer in headlights. I got home on a Wednesday evening. I know it was Wednesday because I remember looking at my mom's calendar. Big and glossy and full of beagle puppies. It always made me smile. My parents fed me Burger King and ice cream cake, then sent me to bed. When I pulled my covers back, I froze. Everything around me blanched, turning pale and glassy. Everything except the dirty tufts of neon bright fur on my pillow. My parents assumed I did it and yelled at me for almost an hour, but they let me sleep in their bed anyways. School was a nightmare. I spent the entire morning dreading recess. When the bell rang, I thought about throwing a tantrum just to stay in the classroom. But I'd get in trouble. My parents would be angry. I'd go to the principal's office. Besides, there'd be other kids on the playground. Vibrant, living, colorful, noisy kids. All that noise and brightness might be too much for Muppet Man. I told myself these things, but still ran to the bathroom when the bell rang. I threw up, then sat in a stall until a teacher, who was no doubt summoned by a tattletale, came and told me that I had to go outside. I dithered in the corner by the tetherball court, as far away from the oak tree as I could get. Even from a distance, I thought I caught glimpses of bright fur slithering along the branches. I decided I was seeing things. When the days finally got warmer, steel skies softening to rich blue in the daytime and Easter egg colors at night, bare branches sprouting buds, flowers growing in the planter boxes all around the school, I resumed my recess ritual of reading under the tree. I was cautious at first, but determined. Every adult in my life had convinced me that I was hallucinating. Every kid in the school knew I'd had a breakdown about Muppet Man. The taunts alone were enough to steel my resolve. Before I knew it, I was reading under the tree like always. The glassy winter horror, barely more than a memory. One afternoon in April, something pulled me out of my book. I didn't know what it was at first. Maybe the kids screaming on the jungle gym. Maybe the 5th grade girls gossiping a few yards away. Maybe the warm breeze rustling the leaves. I looked down and gasped. Larvae crawled along my arms. The yellow-white caterpillar worms that lived in the bark. The kind that all the kids said the Muppet Man loved to eat. I ran to the tetherball court and lingered until the bell rang. When I got home that afternoon, I found clusters of neon fur all over my bedroom. I ran to my mother, and she lost her temper, marched me into the backyard, and told me to stay until she was done cleaning up after me. When I finished crying, I settled myself under the apricot tree and got lost in my book. As the afternoon light deepened, rich daylight giving way to copper, something snapped me out of my reverie. I looked down and saw white worms, soft and tiny and somehow wet, inching all over my arms.
Hello?
Whispered an unpleasantly friendly voice.
Sorry it's been so long. I guess I've been a bad friend.
I'm crazy, I whispered. I snapped my book shut and closed my eyes. Crazy, 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 crazy. Scratchy polyester fur clumped against my skin.
Not crazy.
Muppet Man said.
Just really real. Just like me and Jason Hughes. What are you reading?
He reached out, blinding multicolor fur, blazing in the dappled sunlight, and flipped the book over.
Black Beauty, is it any good?
It's great, I wheezed. I wanted to leap to my feet. I wanted to run screaming into the house, but my bones felt watery and frozen at once. I wouldn't be able to stand up, let alone run. Muppet Man brushed the worms off my arm and settled down beside me. His fur made me feel itchy. I didn't look up. I already knew what I would see. That slothy dinosaur face dominated by glass eyes that would blaze in the dying sun. I didn't want to see it. I was afraid of what would happen if I did. My mom will see you, I whispered. He patted my arm, fur crunching again.
You should read to me.
Tears flooded in my eyes. No. Strong, fuzzy fingers wrapped my wrists.
I want you to read to me.
No.
If you read to me, I'll take you to Jason Hughes.
I almost scoffed. Jason Hughes with the giant glasses and keening voice. Anxious Jason Hughes who stole all the art paper in the classroom just to draw his stupid fish and stupid beetles. Jason Hughes who'd been reduced to bloody, shit-stained clothes at the base of the schoolyard tree. Why? I asked.
Because we're lonely.
Muppet Man said. I glanced at the house, praying my mother would look out and see us. If he's lonely, he should come home.
He can't. His mom doesn't like him.
I pondered this briefly. I thought of my dad, my poor dad who worked himself to death with overtime. My poor dad who couldn't catch a break at work. What if I could help him? What if I could find Jason Hughes and give my dad all the credit? When would I see Jason?
It depends,
said Muppet Man.
On how well you read.
I opened my book to the very first page and began to read aloud. The scrape of the sliding glass door broke my concentration shortly after. I looked up and saw my mom. My heart leapt to my throat. I spun around hopefully, but Muppet Man was gone. The next morning I found clumps of neon fur in my dresser drawers. It clung to my pants and shirt like lint. At the end of May I found a note on the windowsill. Neatly folded construction paper printed with brightly colored marker. Come to the school tree tonight at 11. Your friend, M.M. Coarse strands of yellow, pink, and blue hair sprinkled the note. I brushed them off and tucked the paper in my pocket. I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't go alone. I was terrified of Muppet Man and almost terrified of what my parents would do if they caught me sneaking out. So I went to my father. I showed him the note and begged until I wept. He accused me of making it up for a while, but in the end he agreed to take me to the school at the appointed time. We lived only a few blocks away, so we walked. The evening was unseasonably cold, almost as cold as the day I first met Muppet Man. I fought back tears the entire way, clutching my father's hand with both of my own. The school gates were locked, of course, but there was a small gate hidden in a passage behind the cafeteria. It had nothing but a simple latch. The kids all knew about it, but the adults never did anything. I led my father around the perimeter of the playground, keeping close to the buildings in order to hide in the shadows. "Wait here," I whispered. He obliged, looking tired even in the darkness. I looked at the tree. It didn't look sick anymore. Leaves hid the mistletoe infestation. It looked full and healthy, the eternal century once more. I stood by the trunk and whispered hello. Something rustled among the leaves overhead.
Hello,
Came Muppet Man's warm, full voice. Where's Jason? The branches rattled and a dark, furry shape slithered down the tree. Glassy eyes caught the light of the moon and blazed.
He's inside of me.
The Muppet Man twisted and stretched down the tree until his eyes were level with mine. No longer was he vibrant or bright. His fur was filthy, caked with mud and sand, and bare, dirty canvas replaced large swaths of the once lush neon coat. Of course he was missing fur. He'd been leaving clumps of it all over my room for months. It was a wonder he had any hair left. What do you mean? My voice issued a thin, wheezy whine. Muppet Man crept closer, holding me captive with his glassy eyes. His long, thin fingers touched his chin and pushed, sliding into his face and pulling it up like a child removing a Halloween mask. My heart thudded, heavy and horrid as a war drum. Enormous glasses glinted in the moonlight, tragically oversized for the decayed little face underneath. Jason Hughes' rotted head was gray and so very fragile, gleaming like clouded glass under the moon. If I touched him, he would shatter. The absurd costume fell to the ground with a whisper, dull and faded. Even the eyes were dead now. The costume was dead. It had never been alive. Jason's empty sockets bulged, then broke and split apart with a series of soft, papery pops. Something roiled inside, thick and dark and gleaming, with 1,000 dim lights and colors that I couldn't name. The world flipped, and cold playground sand dug into my face. My dad's scream shattered the glassy silence. Perhaps it shattered Jason's poor dead face, too. I curled up and lay still as my dad screamed and sirens wailed in the distance. The ruined costume went into an evidence locker. Jason himself was laid to rest several weeks later. They held onto the body as long as they did in order to find out what happened to him. I asked my father about it, but he refused to tell me. I was disappointed, yet relieved, and I never tried to find out on my own. I did my best to forget everything, and actually came close. I might have managed had my father kept his mouth shut. He has a habit of telling me things I shouldn't know. Things nobody should know. I guess it's a personal exorcism, freeing the demons that haunt you. It's just that the problem with freeing demons is that demons usually go on to haunt someone else. My dad retired a few years ago, but he still has friends on the force. They get together and talk every once in a while. They had one of their visits last night, and one of his friends brought up Jason Hughes. Did they find the guy who did it? My dad asked. No, said his friend. But the costume, that weird Muppet costume, it's not in evidence anymore. It's gone. Did someone take it, or did they accidentally toss it? We don't know. That alone was enough to haunt me forever. But it didn't stop it enough. Demons never stop it enough, if they ever stop at all. I know this because when I got up this morning, I found dirty tufts of neon fur scattered all across my bedroom floor. My wife and I just moved into a modern home on a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburbs, a few months after she broke the wonderful news that she was pregnant. We'd done extensive research to find this house. It's only a quarter-mile from a school and off the highway, a safe little haven from busy roads, and it's not too far from my job. After the movers left and a few hours spent unpacking and relaxing, Sharon and I finally slept in our new home 2 nights ago. I'm a bit of an insomniac already, and in a new place I found myself tossing and turning. I eventually read the 2:30 a.m. on my bright phone screen and sighed. I finally got up and wandered downstairs and poured a glass of water. Then I walked to the living room and opened the window for some fresh air, a habit that I found myself engaging in since quitting smoking. Through the open window, I heard a muffled woman's voice speaking, and I realized it was coming from the next-door neighbor's house. I looked over to the neighbor's house's side window, and through it I saw a woman in her 50s standing profile in her unlit living room, barely visible due to the cold glow of the moon's light. She stood there, extending a hand forward and raising it up and down, as if pantomiming the action of shaking a hand in greeting. I had to strain my ears and focus, but I was able to hear what she was saying as she repeated that action. "Ah, you're the new residents. I'm Mrs. Ainsworth." The woman spoke before tilting her head back to look at the ceiling. "What a nice day. Funny to think it's nearly October. She twitched into an odd shiver, clearly having trouble at the end before trying it again. "What a nice day. Funny to think Halloween is nearly here," she repeated before restarting the sequence with a handshake gesture over and over. I felt guilty spying and didn't want to speculate about what speech impediment or possible neurosis my neighbor might have. Though creeped out a bit, I headed back to bed and eventually fell asleep. I woke up yesterday morning to the smell of sizzling bacon and the nostalgic sounds of the Pet Shop Boys from downstairs. And I coasted through my morning routine with time to spare. The house felt like a home, and when I descended the stairs to see Sharon wiggling her butt to the 80s track West End Girls in her plaid pajamas, it was. I couldn't help but smile as I wiped the sleep from my eyes while Sharon sang into the spatula and performed an impromptu dance routine before wrapping her arms around me. "Babe, I swear, it's perfect. Do you hear that?" she asked, cocking her head toward the Bluetooth speaker. I nodded with a smile. "We can play music without the neighbors banging on our wall. There are no drunk assholes pissing outside our window. And look at this," Sharon said, using the spatula as a pointer to the wide granite countertops and then to our plates of eggs and bacon. "I have room to cook." I smiled. Her comment about the window reminded me of the night, and I almost said something about the neighbor, but Sharon was in such a good mood, so I let it go. We need to make sure we unpack all the CDs, not just the 80s jams you stole from your parents, I joked, and she rolled her eyes. I soon kissed my wife and headed out the front door into the golden sun in our picturesque American suburb. I unlocked my car when I felt staring eyes, and I turned my head to see a woman, that neighbor from the night before, watching me for a second before walking over. She was wearing the same outfit as she extended a thin hand, which I shook, feeling her cold skin as she said those words. "Ah, you're the new resident. I'm Mrs. Ainsworth," she said before looking up at the sky. "What a nice day. Funny to think Halloween is nearly here," she said, flashing a large, strange smile. Yes, it is a nice day." I tried not to trip over my words. I introduced myself and motioned to my wife in the doorway, who waved and smiled. Mrs. Ainsworth kept that broad grin on her face as she walked backwards a few steps before turning and briskly walking into her house, ducking under the garage door, then shutting it abruptly. My gaze drifted back to Sharon, who gave me the "what was that" look. I shrugged and shook my head before getting in the car, trying to focus on the day ahead. Yesterday evening, when I arrived home after a tiring day of work, Sharon and I discussed the eccentric neighbor, and I explained what I had seen in the middle of the night. That Mrs. Ainsworth had been practicing all night to introduce herself. "She clearly wanted to make a good impression," Sharon said with a wink and a smile. "Wait, should I be jealous, babe?" she added jokingly. "Oh yes, you should," I said, and she smacked my shoulder before I continued normally. "I'm being serious, it was creepy." Sharon didn't seem bothered by it, suggested that maybe the neighbor had suffered from a TBI, traumatic brain injury. She explained that she'd seen a few in her years as a therapist. I shrugged and thought that it was possible, but I wasn't content with that answer. As the evening carried on, however, I eventually found myself feeling less on edge, and we enjoyed a romantic evening in. We fell asleep in each other's arms, and I almost slept through the night. I tossed and turned again and woke up around 2 a.m., needing to use the bathroom. As I was about to switch off the light and leave, I looked out the upstairs window and my hair stood on end. From that angle, I could see into multiple rooms of the neighbors' houses in the cul-de-sac. In every home, I could see at least one of the neighbors, fully dressed and standing in the dark. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but they were all just practicing everyday tasks. Things that were normal during daylight, but unsettling in those dark rooms in the middle of the night alone. A chubby man in a sweatsuit and a headband jogged in place in his living room with the lights out, before turning his head in a double take and waving as if spotting someone. In another home's upstairs window, a little girl with blonde hair skipped with a jump rope in her dark bedroom. Then I looked 2 houses over to a man dressed in oil-stained overalls, leaning on his kitchen table and using a wrench as if he were fixing something invisible. He paused every so often to wipe his forehead with his hairy wrist. After watching him for a few minutes, his head turned to me and his eyes locked onto mine, causing me to stumble back and duck out of the way of view with a racing heart. When I finally peeked out again, he was gone. I was barely able to sleep after an hour of trying to make sense of it in my mind. This morning, I got dressed and shuffled downstairs to meet Sharon as she poured me a glass of OJ and scrambled some eggs. I explained that something wasn't right with the neighbors, that they were practicing acting normal in their dark homes at night. She said, rather coldly, that I needed sleep and that I was overthinking things. After nearly getting into a fight, she told me she'd look out for anything peculiar as I chugged some coffee before heading out into the crisp air. Underslept and on edge, when I stepped into the sunlight, I heard rhythmic tapping and I turned. There I saw the fair-haired blonde child skipping rope in a driveway across the street. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I turned my head more to see the white truck in the driveway of that other neighbor in overalls, as he leaned under the hood with his wrench to fix the engine. I watched the practice routine continue as he wiped his brow with his hairy wrist. My eyes then darted to the chubby man in a sweatsuit and a headband jogging down the sidewalk in my direction. He soon turned his head, pretending to be surprised by seeing me, and then he gave that friendly wave I had seen him practice over and over again last night. As he jogged past, I watched his face drop slack as he rotated his head out of view, continuing on. I drove out of our cul-de-sac but soon pulled over the shoulder of the main road and watched. I called Sharon, unable to even drive to work as I sat in my car, parked on the shoulder until she finally answered. She kept throwing around terms like adjustment disorder and delusional, but she didn't see them all practicing last night like I did. She didn't pull onto the shoulder of the highway to watch the jogging man continue around his house and stop at the back door, dead in his tracks. She didn't see those thin, spidery legs slowly reach out from his parted lips before he entered. I pray it's nothing, but she also didn't call me babe this morning as she usually does. She called me hun. I know it's a long shot, but have you guys ever heard of Cumberland, Kentucky? I asked somebody this once upon a time, but the only yes I got back was from a friend of mine who really likes comic books. Apparently, one of the not-so-well-known X-Men was born in a fictionalized version of the town. In reality, it's a coal town, though looking back at the records, it used to be booming once upon a time. City park, movie theater, department stores, the whole 9 yards. It's mostly empty now. The shuttered mines had a lot to do with it, because with coal out of commission, the town's money began to dry up. People moved on to greener pastures, business owners boarded up storefronts and walked away from their dreams. You can't help but be depressed, even if you're an outsider, but it's a gold mine if you're an explorer who doesn't mind running afoul of a couple of small-time cops. I'm one of those explorers. My girlfriend was too. For a time, but after a few close calls with some unstable floors, she threw up her hands and told me I was on my own. One broken ankle was enough. At least she still helped me plan my excursions, taking notes of interesting things she drove by or found on Google Street View. Most of them were within driving distance, extended day trip distance at most, but Cumberland was an exception. The location wasn't one she found on Google Maps. It definitely wasn't one she drove past considering we live in North Carolina. She found it on an Urban Explorer forum that she was prodding at for old time's sake, in some big thread pinned at the top about the most interesting places in their local area. It seemed like an attempt at making a big database of buildings and ruins to hit up, she said, but it was mostly just bullshit. Right in the middle, though, she found a post that caught her eye. A user wrote a badly punctuated blurb about some place that wasn't local, but had still left an impression on him. He didn't specify how, only that it was a few hours away from him, before following it up with a link to a live journal that had been hacked by Russian bots. Most of it was indecipherable Cyrillic, one post every couple of days, which I guess kept the journal active enough that it wasn't purged. If you went far back enough in the archives, though, you could find the posts of the original author. Some girl, early 20s, who lived out of her van on what seemed to be a road trip exploring haunted places. She'd post satellite views from Google and have areas circled in MS Paint and numbered, with descriptions of what was supposed to be there. She'd then follow up her posts debunking these places before moving on down the next road. Her final post was 2011, and had an aerial view of a house covered in trees at the end of a dead-end road. The entry was brief and said something like, 109B Fugate Drive, Cumberland, Kentucky. It's just a tiny abandoned house. I don't know why I'm bothering. Not exactly creepy, but it was interesting enough that it stuck with my girlfriend, and me too. Once she told me about it, I've always been a sucker for internet mysteries, and when I looked up the distance online, Cumberland was only about a 5 or 6 hour drive away from Durham. My girlfriend told me it was a dumb idea to waste gas money on the trip. But I wanted to go. It was a nowhere place, and I was pretty confident that it would be a bust, but there was part of me who wanted to be a part of this subtly creepy, obscure internet lore that, I won't lie, I thought I could milk for online attention since people eat this sort of thing up. Yes, I'm a whore. Thank you. First things first, Cumberland is a depressing place full of nice but defeated people. Before I left, I read about it online, since the only thing I could find out from people around me was that Cannonball was born there. Nothing you read can prepare you for how empty and heartbreaking the place is. You can throw a rock from one end of the main road to the other. Almost all the stores are empty, the high school is a husk, and there's countless vacant lots where homes and buildings used to be. There's a city park, but the grass was knee-high. There's a state park, but it seems nobody ever goes there. And the general reaction you get as an outsider is wariness and confusion. Nobody knows why you'd bother to be there, so they're automatically suspicious of why you showed up. Second, Fugate Drive is very hard to get to. This is despite the fact that it was right there, immediately where I got off the interstate. You drive down a hill, there's some Methodist church and a house, and the street right by it is Fugate Drive. But you have to circle around because of the fact that so many roads are one way and there's only one entrance and no exit. In the end, I wound up going the wrong way on a road just to get there because I figured the place was essentially a ghost town. What was the chance of me getting hit? Third, 109B Fugate Drive does not fit in with the rest of the street. Fugate Drive was one of the nicer roads I saw while driving around, at the bottom of a small hill with a 1950s, almost model-like quality to it. The very first houses you see are well kept, and one of them is massive, and as far as I can tell, seems to have a goddamn tunnel connecting it to the Methodist church. There's a parking lot for the church, rows of smaller houses, flower beds, dogwood trees, and the very end of the road is right next to a river. It very much looks like an ideal place to raise a family. Until you get to 109B. 109B is hard to identify because the address fell off the mailbox. And the mailbox is on the house. And the house is on the opposite side of a chain link fence. Reaching it is harder. The grass is high, the gate is locked and tangled in vines, pretty ones with flowers oddly enough, and the foliage is insane. There's signs that somebody tends to it sometimes, but sporadically, like they don't want to be there. And that's not even counting the fact that the entire house is cut off by cars lining the end of the drive. The neighbors of 109B use the road as their own personal parking lot and get pretty irate about strangers being on what they perceive as their own personal property. This leads me to my fourth point. Fugate Drive seems to be adamant about keeping everyone away from 109B. It makes sense when you read about it. The house is tiny, structurally unstable, and on private property, so of course they'd want to keep you away. The weird part is just how united they are in their defense of 109B. When I first drove onto the street, I could feel them looking out their windows to see if I would stick around or if I was just a turned around out-of-towner. Once I made my way to the end of the street, they were actively coming out of their homes to confront me. The two main mouthpieces were an old lady and a police officer, who was in full uniform like he was prepared to intercept me. I tried to play it off as being interested in the property, but when I couldn't tell them how I knew about it, and they pointed out it was nighttime, the handcuffs came out. I'm not an idiot, so I bailed, long enough to get a hotel room at the only one in town, or at least the only one I could find. It gave me a place to park my car and store my things, and was close enough that I could walk back to Fugate Drive in about a half hour. And that's basically what I did as soon as I got my keys, cutting through yards and alleys to avoid being seen. I don't know the exact time I got back to Fugate Drive, but it couldn't have been before midnight. Without my car and out-of-town tags, nobody noticed since I used everything available as cover. I just sprinted between objects, jumped/climbed/tripped over the fence, and was able to wade through the jungle-thick growth. Things I noticed immediately as I was awkwardly circling the building. The house is extremely small, but the property itself is huge, maybe half an acre. It doesn't look like it from the street, though. The porch is painted in flaking paint and is made from a lopsided concrete block. There's a rusty shed I couldn't get open despite the fact that the lock was broken. There's a back door that leads into a bedroom, and it's probably the sturdiest door I've ever seen. There's a couple of holes in the side of the building facing the river, one of which is a perfect rectangle, which is bizarre, and one leading under the house. I used the rectangle hole to get in because the back door was not having any of it. Things I noticed immediately as I fell face first into the building. The living room and kitchen fused together, and the appliances are all dated. The carpet in the living room is this disgusting brown color, but the tiles in the kitchen remind me of blue and white pottery. There's furniture and belongings everywhere. Art is still up on the walls. There's a blue pantry cabinet with canned food still in it. Whoever left was either in a hurry or ceased to exist. I won't lie, Spooky as it seemed at first glance, I felt cheated once I stood up and got my bearings. Briars had scraped me, my pants were caked in those sticky little seeds, and all for a house that was maybe the size of a studio apartment. There wasn't much more to look at after I got my initial glimpse. I spent about a half an hour pacing back and forth and sighing, trying to get my money's worth. The floor was bulging. There were holes in the ceiling and the kitchen floor. The entire place reeked. That was about it. I eventually decided I'd just try to piece together the story of who had lived here before, thinking that maybe if I dug around for some backstory, I'd figure out why that forum poster would bother even to recommend this place. It took a lot of courage to make myself sit on the floor. It was disgusting. But I wound up spending the bulk of my time on my ass digging through plastic bags. What I eventually pieced together was that the place was probably abandoned back in the early 90s or late 80s. There were heaps of clothes that looked like they belonged to Daria, and dated knickknacks all around. Lots of cassette tapes and an old portable cassette player, for example. As far as I could tell, whoever abandoned the place had lived there alone, since only one of the bedrooms was actually a bedroom. The one closest to the front door was just a glorified closet. The longer I stayed, the more freaked out I got. As I said earlier, the place reeked, but it started to get progressively worse until I'd have to abandon rooms entirely. I could hear shuffling and knocking above the ceiling and under the floor, and occasionally on the opposite side of walls. Common sense said that it was probably rats, possums, or maybe a raccoon. But sometimes, something would hit so hard that the ground would shake or flaking paint would rain from above. And I swear, the smell followed me. After a couple hours, I decided enough was enough. My nerves were shot after the raccoon decided to slam itself against the wall beside my head, followed by what seemed like something scaling the wall, then shuffling from above the ceiling and more dust falling from above. My heart was in my throat, probably because either the place was crawling with wild animals or somebody else was in the house. Probably not a neighbor, I figured, but a vagrant. The problem was that my exit was that rectangular hole cut into the wall in the living room, and whatever was above me in the ceiling seemed to start heading in the same direction. The bumping and dragging above me kept in stride as I closed the gap between the bedroom and my escape in maybe 3 steps at most. It did eventually veer away from me somewhere in the living room, knocking around as it scurried into the one room I hadn't checked, the bathroom. It never occurred to me to investigate the bathroom, even though it was right beside where I crawled in. If I hadn't gotten spooked, I would have probably poked my head in eventually, but nothing about it seemed interesting from the get-go. When that dragging knock-knock sound began to trail in that direction, though, curiosity got the best of me. I pointed my flashlight up from the floor and shone it inside. Tile flooring, antique door handle. I saw something trailing from above and behind the door frame, slick and red and dripping. The drops never hit the floor though. They just kind of fizzled out of existence on the way down. I always imagined that if I ever came face to face with something horrifying that I'd be smart enough to run, but shock kept me from even registering what I was looking at by the time it clicked that there were streamers of entrails dangling at the bathroom door. Whatever owned those guts had a chance to get a pretty good look at me, and I knew this because I could feel it staring, even if I was too much of a pussy to follow the trail of innards to see where they went. Hello. Plain, clear, feminine, and average. I jerked the light upward and upside down, and beginning to crawl over the top of the door frame was, well, half a woman. Her intestines were still attached. Her hair was red with blood, and half of it had either been shaved or pulled out. She was pale and freckled and covered in dirt. There were ropes, too, like she'd been tied up before she came to greet me. Her jaw was crooked, not lopsided and not broken, but just crooked enough to look painful. Her eyes were black in every sense of the word. I stared at her. She stared back. Again in that normal voice. Hello? I didn't answer. Hello, Desmond. It knew my name. I don't even know how it knew my name, but it knew my fucking name. I made a jerking motion towards the exit, but she followed suit. She was fast, she was strong, and she clung to the ceiling and walls like a gecko. Organs draped over her, but she left no marks on anything. When I reached the hole, she was arched down in front of my face, chest pressed against the tacky wallpaper. "How did your girlfriend actually break her ankle?" she asked. My mind spun. I don't actually remember what I said, but it probably wasn't actual English. "Did Ashley really fall? Is that why she didn't come to?" When I threatened to pull away and head back towards the door, she fisted her hand in my shirt collar and dragged me back. Everything about her was gritty and disgusting. Her teeth were stained. Dirt and dried blood were caked across her cheeks. She stared at me for a good long while. At least, it seemed like it. Realistically, it was probably only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity that we just stood there, nose to nose, staring at each other in silence. With every second that ticked past, her expression began to change. Anger, then confusion, then what I swear was embarrassment. "She really did fall, didn't she?" She turned me loose inside. It came out like a death rattle. She began to slide backwards up the wall, like an animation run in reverse. Everything about it was surreal. "Well, fuck me. You should probably leave then." The tone wasn't threatening. It was matter of fact, like someone who just realized how late it was and they had work in the morning. She turned, dragged herself back across the ceiling, and vanished into the bathroom. I saw the entrails vanish upward, then heard shuffling and knocking above me. There wasn't a smear left on anything, like every trace of her just vanished in her wake. I vanished out the window. I don't think the grass or vines slowed me down, and neither did the fence. Suddenly, I was a parkour master, vaulting over shrubs and chain link and anything that stood between me and a clean escape. As I bolted through the neighborhood, I could feel myself being watched and saw a few lights turn on in houses, but I didn't stop. I didn't even get the chance to be apprehended before I was up the hill and to my hotel. I didn't stay in Cumberland. I just grabbed my things, loaded up my car, and made a 6-hour drive in a grand total of 4. I never even called my girlfriend to tell her I was coming back, and as I found out later, I actually didn't have my phone on my person. The last place I remembered seeing it was when I was going through bags. I had it sitting next to me so I could keep track of the time, and I couldn't remember putting it back in my pocket. I just got freaked out, grabbed my flashlight, and ran. Of course, nobody believed me, though I really didn't need to tell anyone but my girlfriend. She laughed and made some comments about the house needing a carbon monoxide detector. I couldn't think of where carbon monoxide would come from in a house that hadn't been lived in for somewhere between 25 and 30 years, but it made a lot more sense than seeing a dismembered woman crawling on the ceiling of an abandoned house. At least, until my girlfriend came to me the other night, confused. Over the course of an episode of American Vandal, an amazing show by the way, she asked me 2 or 3 times where I lost my phone, and whenever I'd answer that I'd dropped it in 109B, she'd get real quiet. We never even got a chance to see how the episode ended before she sidled up to me and forced her phone in my face. She had a message. From me. Written in broken, dyslexic English. The message read, "You left your phone in my house. If you want it, come back. And bring Ashley. Me and her need to have a talk."